Today, on the daily chart, Bitcoin is trying to show signs of reaction. The winds is trying to begin a new regime, blowing green winds. The flow geometry continues to give us consistent support and resistance zones, and the pressure is attempting a regime change, trying to enter positive pressure. But a reaction on the daily chart is not necessarily a structural shift. The daily chart often speaks before the weekly, but it can also whisper false hopes when the larger regime has not yet turned. I observe, not instruct, for educational purposes only. To understand a movement, sometimes we need to look at what the movement is facing, not only the price, but the force standing against it. And perhaps at this moment, the most important question about Bitcoin is not inside Bitcoin alone. We need to compare it with an older relative. This is Bitcoin versus the S&P 500. Here we are not looking at Bitcoin's absolute price. We are looking at its relative strength against the traditional market. If the pair is near 10, it means one Bitcoin is worth approximately 10 times the level of the S&P 500. This is not a reading about dollars. It is a reading about leadership. Bitcoin can rise in dollar terms and still lose strength against the market it should be outperforming. So the question of this episode is simple. Is Bitcoin leading again, or is it only breathing while the S&P 500 still carries more structural strength? To answer this, we need to return to the moment when the chart still looked strong, because the market often reveals its weakness before it confesses through price. In the week of September 29, 2025, Bitcoin was testing its all-time high, near $125,000. On the surface, there was still strength. But when we place Bitcoin against the S&P 500, the reading begins to change. The pressure was already attempting a turn into the negative regime. In other words, while the relative price was still trying to rise, the relative pressure was already falling. That divergence was the first warning. It was not a sentence. It was a loss of quality, the kind of detail that price alone often hides. Then came the second window. In the week of December 8th, the winds turned negative on the BTC/SPX pair. The pressure was already deeply negative, and Bitcoin, viewed by itself, was still worth around $85,000. Those watching only Bitcoin could already see a sharp decline, but those watching Bitcoin against the market saw something more serious. Here, price confessed what the relationship had already been saying. Now we return to the present. The Bitcoin S&P 500 pair broke above a descending diagonal that began in October. This looks like a breath, but the breakout is already meeting resistance at the median of the duplicated channel above. At the same time, the pair returned inside a recent ascending diagonal channel, suggesting that we may have seen a false breakdown. The winds remains negative, and it is also acting as a barrier against the pair's ascent. The pressure also remains negative, and although pressure is trying to ease, there is still no clear regime shift. The movement breathes, but the main inertia has not changed yet. This is the difference between reaction and leadership. On the daily chart, Bitcoin is trying to improve, but against the S&P 500, on the weekly chart, it has not yet recovered dominance. And while that does not change, I treat the movement with caution, not because Bitcoin cannot rise, but because rising is not the same as being the best option in that moment. I keep observing. Time decides the rest.